15 years have passed, but that night still clings to me like a dark shadow. I was just a kid back then, barely old enough to understand what fear really was, but I learned quickly. The house I grew up in was nestled deep in a small, isolated town in Maine, a place where the trees outnumbered the people, and the silence was often more unsettling than comforting. It was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened, yet the air always seemed heavy with something unspoken. Our house was old, a relic from another time, creaked and groaned with every shift of the wind as if it were alive and breathing, waiting. The wooden floors were worn down from years of footsteps, each one telling a story I never wanted to hear. My parents had always talked about fixing the place up. They never got around to it. Maybe they thought the house's character was worth preserving. I hated it. There was something off about that house, something that set my teeth on edge, especially when I was alone. Even in the daylight, the shadows seemed too deep, too dark, but it was at night when the real terror set in. Now, 15 years later, I still can't shake the memories. That house, with its peeling paint and broken windows, still haunts me. I've moved on, or at least tried to, but there are nights when I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that I can hear those same creaks and whispers, like the house is calling me back, but I'll never go back, not after what happened. That house was more than just a place to live. It was a presence, something that watched and waited. Floorboards creaked with every step, even when no one was there to make them groan. It was as if the house had a life of its own, an ancient, weary soul trapped within those wooden walls. The dim lighting never helped either. No matter how many lamps we had on, corners of every room remained shrouded in shadow, as if the darkness refused to fully retreat. The house was built sometime in the early 1900s, back when the town was first being settled. My parents used to say it had character. To me, it was just old and strange. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to peel a little more every year, revealing the cracked, discolored wood underneath. The windows rattled in their frames whenever the wind blew, and the whole place seemed to groan in protest whenever a storm rolled in. I remember hearing whispers around town about the house. People would talk about how it had changed hands more times than anyone could count, how families needed to stay long. There were rumors, stories about things that happened there, things people saw or heard but never really talked about openly. I overheard bits and pieces of those stories as a kid, enough to know that something wasn't right. There were nights when I'd lie in bed, listening to the house settle around me. The creaks and cracks would echo through the halls, sounding almost like footsteps. I'd pull the covers over my head, trying to block out the sounds, but they always found a way through. Sometimes it felt like the house was breathing, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs. Each groan, quiet exhale. My parents said it was all in my head, just the normal sounds of an old house. But deep down, I knew better. There was something alive in that house, something old and angry, and I could feel it watching me. It started with the voices. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're half asleep and your mind plays tricks on you. I'd be lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to drift off, when I'd hear something, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It was so soft, I could almost convince myself it was nothing. Almost. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent it became. The whispers were low, muffled, like they were coming from somewhere deep within the house, seeping through the walls. They weren't words I could understand, more like a jumble of sound, like someone was speaking in a language I didn't know. Sometimes it sounded like a single voice, but other times it was like there were several of them, all overlapping, like all speaking at once. I told myself it was just the wind. The house was old, after all, and old houses make noises. But deep down, I knew this was different. The wind doesn't whisper like that. The house settling doesn't sound like someone murmuring right outside your bedroom door. The worst part was that the voices seemed to come closer each night. First, they were distant, almost as if they were coming from the far end of the house, but soon they moved closer, inching their way down the hallway until it felt like they were right outside my room. I'd lie there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the whispers to stop. They never did. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. I tried telling my parents about it, but they just brushed it off. Old houses make weird noises, Dad said. Probably just the wind or the pipes. But I knew better. I could feel it in my gut, that primal instinct that tells you something is very, very wrong. The whispers started to invade my dreams too. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'd heard someone whispering my name just as I was about to fall asleep. But when I opened my eyes, the room was empty, silent, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. That's when the fear really started to set in. It wasn't just about the whispers themselves, but what they meant. I didn't know what was worse, the thought that something was in the house with me, or the idea that I might be losing my mind. But the voices weren't going away. They were getting louder, and I was starting to dread the nights more than anything, because I knew, deep down, something was coming. The night my parents left me alone was the worst of my life. They both had to work late, something about a big project that couldn't wait. Normally, I'd have gone to a friend's house or maybe stayed with my grandmother, but for some reason, they thought I'd be okay on my own. I remember the forced smile on my mom's face as she kissed me goodbye, telling me I was old enough to handle one night by myself. I tried to believe her, but as soon as the door closed behind them, I felt that familiar knot of fear tighten in my chest. The house was eerily quiet at first, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to distract myself with TV, but every little sound made me jump. Ticking of the clock, hum of the fridge, even the wind rustling through the trees outside. The daylight was fading fast, and with it, any sense of safety I'd managed to hold on to. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house seemed to come alive. Creaks and groans that I'd grown used to over the years suddenly felt different, more deliberate, like something was moving around, testing the floorboards. I tried to ignore it, convince myself it was just the old wood settling. The sound of it was relentless, a constant reminder that I wasn't really alone. Then the voices started again. Only this time, they weren't faint whispers at the edge of my hearing. They were clear, almost loud enough to make out the words. They seemed to be coming from all around me, circling the room, growing louder and more urgent with each passing minute. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the footsteps slowly made their way up, one creak at a time. They were heavy, deliberate, like someone was taking their time, savoring each step. The sound was so clear, so real, that I almost expected to see my dad coming up the stairs. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't possible. My parents wouldn't be home for hours. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped, just outside my bedroom door. I was paralyzed with fear, too terrified to move, to even breathe. The only sound in the room was the frantic beating of my heart echoing in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The voices had gone silent, and the footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, like something was standing just on the other side of the door, waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But eventually, the fear became too much. I had to get out, had to escape that house before whatever was out there found me. As I lay there, frozen in fear, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of my vision. My heart skipped a beat, and I snapped my head toward the source, but there was nothing there. Just the same dimly lit room, the same shadows pooling in the corners. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, product of the fear that was gnawing at my sanity. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Then it happened again, another quick, darting movement, this time on the other side of the room. It was faster than before, almost like it was trying to avoid being seen. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide, scanning the room for any sign of what I'd just seen. The shadows remained still, mocking me with their silence. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, every hair on my body standing on end. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my hands shook as I clutched the edge of the blanket, as if it could somehow protect me from whatever was lurking in the darkness. That's when I heard it, a low, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Noise was coming from upstairs directly above my room. I knew, without a doubt, that I was the only one home. My parents were still hours away, and there was no one else in the house. But the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, as if something or someone was moving across the floor with slow, purposeful intent. I strained to listen, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear over it. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it was right above me. It was a horrible grating noise, like wood against wood or nails scraping across the floorboards. I wanted to believe it was just the house settling, just the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too real. Couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted for the door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a second to fumble with the doorknob, but I finally managed to yank the door open. The hallway was dark, the shadows thick and oppressive, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught another glimpse of movement, a shadowy figure, darting down the stairs ahead of me. It moved so fast, I barely had time to register it before it disappeared into the darkness below. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Whatever it was leading me straight to the front door, almost as if it wanted me to leave. But before I could take another step, the dragging sound started again, this time even louder. It was right above me, moving towards the stairs. My mind raced with panic. I didn't want to find out what was making that noise. I just needed to get out of the house now. Couldn't stay in that house another second. Fear had taken over, driving out every rational thought. All I knew was that I had to get out, now. I didn't care that it was pouring rain outside. Didn't care that I was in my pajamas with no shoes. None of it mattered. The only thing that did was putting as much distance between me and whatever was lurking in that house. I tore down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I ran. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the house breathing down my neck, like it was trying to swallow me whole. I hit the front door with enough force to nearly knock it off its hinges. Cold rain slapped me in the face as I burst outside. I barely felt it. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets. I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the muddy ground slipping under my bare feet, the storm raging around me. My grandmother's house was only a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. Every step was a battle against the storm, the rain soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I kept running, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that something was chasing me. When I finally reached my grandmother's house, I was drenched, shivering, and barely able to catch my breath. I banged on the door with both fists, desperate for her to let me in. Porch light flicked on, and a moment later, the door swung open to reveal my grandmother, her face etched with concern. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" she gasped, pulling me inside. I collapsed into her arms, soaking wet and trembling. The words tumbled out of me in a frantic rush, barely coherent, as I tried to explain what had happened. The voices, the shadows, the footsteps, it all poured out of me in a flood of fear and panic. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. She patted my back, trying to calm me down, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Not really. She thought I was just a scared kid with an overactive imagination, spooked by an old house and a stormy night. There, she murmured, guiding me to the couch and wrapping a blanket around me. "It's okay now. You're safe here." I wanted to scream that I wasn't safe, that the house wasn't just some creaky old building, but something much worse. But I was too exhausted, too shaken to argue. Instead, I just nodded, letting her words wash over me, even though they did nothing to ease the terror still coursing through me. As I sat there, dripping rainwater onto the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching me, even from miles away. Fear clung to me, as relentless as the storm outside. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When my parents finally came to get me from my grandmother's house the next morning, I was still a wreck. I hadn't slept at all, too afraid to close my eyes, haunted by the memory of those voices, those shadows. My grandmother had done her best to comfort me. Nothing could shake the terror that had taken root deep inside me. The look on my parents' faces when they saw me was a mix of concern and confusion. They weren't sure what to make of it. I could tell they were worried, but there was also that hint of skepticism, like they weren't entirely convinced that what I'd experienced was real. But seeing me so shaken, so terrified, was enough for them to take it seriously, at least to an extent. They didn't ask too many questions on the drive home, just exchanged nervous glances as I stared out the window, lost in my own thoughts. I could barely bring myself to look at the house when we pulled into the driveway. It loomed over us, as menacing as ever, but now it felt different, more alive, more dangerous. I refused to go inside, and after seeing the panic in my eyes, my parents didn't push me. Instead, they decided to take me to a doctor, hoping he could figure out what was wrong with me. After I described what had happened, the doctor gave me a long, measured look, before finally nodding to himself. He said that what I'd experienced was likely a result of anxiety, maybe even a panic attack triggered by being alone in an old, creaky house during a storm. He talked about how fear could make the mind play tricks, but could turn ordinary sounds and shadows into something far more sinister. But no matter how many times he said it, I couldn't believe it. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. The house wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was evil. The doctor prescribed some medication to help with the anxiety, and suggested that I start seeing a therapist. He assured my parents that with time, I'd be able to face my fears, that I'd learn to see the house for what it really was, just an old building with no power over me. But even as he said it, I could feel the house's presence looming in the back of my mind, refusing to let me go. From that day on, I could never be alone in that house again, especially not at night. The mere thought of it was enough to send me spiraling into panic. I'd hear the whispers in my mind, feel the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest, and I'd have to get out, to be anywhere else but there. Eventually, my parents realized that staying in that house wasn't an option for me anymore. We moved out a few months later, leaving the house behind, not the memories. They followed me, lingering like a dark cloud over every aspect of my life. The anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant feeling of being watched, never really went away. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the fear. I avoid old wooden houses, can't stand being alone in the dark, and any creak or whisper sends me straight back to that night. The house may be in my past, but it's a past that refuses to let go. It's been years since we moved out of that house. The fear still lingers, like a shadow that refuses to fade. I've tried to move on, to leave that night behind me, but it's not that simple. The anxiety never really went away. It's become a part of me, something I've had to learn to live with. Dark, empty houses, especially old wooden ones, still fill me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I avoid them whenever I can. If I have to be in one, I make sure I'm never alone. I keep every light on. Even then, it's hard to breathe, hard to keep the panic at bay. The creaks and groans of old floorboards are enough to send my mind spiraling back to that night. The voices, the shadows, and the heavy footsteps on the stairs. Sleep doesn't come easily anymore. There are nights when I lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to start again. I know they're just memories, echoes of a past I can't escape. But they feel real, too real. And when I do manage to fall asleep, nightmares are never far behind. In them, I'm back in that house, alone in the dark with something just out of sight, waiting. I've spent years in therapy, trying to unravel the fear, to understand what happened that night. The doctors still say it was just anxiety, a young mind playing tricks in the darkness. But deep down, I know the truth. There was something in that house, something beyond my understanding, and it left a mark on me that will never fully heal. The house was sold not long after we left. I never went back, never wanted to. But sometimes I find myself wondering about the new owners. Do they hear the voices at night? Do they see the shadows moving just out of sight? Or did whatever haunted that house leave with me? I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing I do know is that the fear, the anxiety, the memories, they're a part of me now. That house changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. And even though I'm far away from it, I can still feel its presence, lurking in the darkest corners of my mind. No matter where I go, no matter how many years pass, that night is always with me. and so is the fear. It was a quiet evening in Salem, Massachusetts. Kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, making the silence feel thick and almost tangible. I was alone in my family's old house, a place that had always made my skin crawl. But tonight, the eerie stillness was almost suffocating. My wife and kids were away visiting relatives, leaving me to fend off the unsettling solitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the creaky wooden floors, I tried to shake off the creeping unease that clung to me. I settled into my favorite armchair with a book, hoping that the routine would offer some comfort. The air was cold, despite the heater running full blast, and every groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence. That's when I first heard it, a faint whisper. I thought it was just my imagination, thick of the dark. But as I strained to listen, it became clearer, more insistent. It was like someone was speaking just beyond the edge of hearing, a murmur that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were barely audible, like the rustling of leaves or the soft murmur of a distant conversation. I moved around the room, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to follow me. It was disorienting, like the walls were alive, breathing, and watching. I decided to investigate, grabbing a flashlight and moving through the house with an increasing sense of dread. The whispers grew louder as I approached the old, dusty panel in the living room. I pried it open, my hands shaking, and found an old stack of photographs hidden behind it. Photos were yellowed with age, and the people in them had expressions that sent chills down my spine. Their eyes seemed to follow me, their faces twisted in what looked like silent screams. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the whispers intensified, almost as if they were reacting to my discovery. Just then, a loud thud echoed through the house, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the room, but saw nothing out of place. The whispering had turned into a low, unintelligible chant, and it felt like the house was closing in on me. The oppressive silence returned, but now it felt charged, like the calm before a storm. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I tried to steady myself. I could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent lurking just out of sight. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. The house seemed to be alive with something sinister, and the whispers were just the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers had settled into a disturbing murmur. Their rhythm, punctuated by eerie silence, was almost more unsettling. I tried to focus on the photographs I had found, hoping they would provide some explanation for the odd occurrence. The images were of people I didn't recognize, their faces marred by an inexplicable sadness and fear. It was as if they were trapped in time, begging for something I couldn't quite grasp. I decided to investigate further, convinced that there had to be a logical explanation for the whispers and the photographs. I checked the entire house, from the basement to the attic, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The house creaked and groaned with every step I took, each sound amplified by the silence that enveloped me. Then came the first real sign of something being terribly wrong. I heard the whispers again, louder and clearer, as if they were directly in my ear. They seemed to be coming from the upstairs hallway. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I gripped the flashlight tightly, the beam shaking as I climbed the stairs. As I reached the top, the whispers grew more frantic. They were now unmistakably calling my name, distorted and echoing through the empty hallway. I called out, trying to sound confident. "Hello? Someone there?" But my voice felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive air. I followed the sound down the hallway, each step echoing in the darkness. The whispers seemed to lead me toward a small, unused room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was hit by a cold draft that made me gasp. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single old-fashioned rocking chair that was gently swaying back and forth, though there was no breeze. My heart raced as I stepped inside, floorboards creaking under my weight. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unsettling quiet that felt like it was pressing in on me. I shone the flashlight around the room, revealing nothing but dusty old furniture and cobwebs. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow darting across the wall. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I tried to get the light back on. When it finally illuminated the room again, the whispers had returned, now clearly taunting me, their intensity building to a crescendo. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I noticed something written on the wall in a language I didn't understand. The symbols were jagged and unsettling, and they seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. My skin crawled as I realized that the whispers were now forming words. Dark, cryptic messages meant just for me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rocking chair. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if 1,000 eyes were staring through me. I fled the room, the whispers following me down the hall, their mocking tones growing louder with each step. The house felt like it was closing in on me, and I was desperate to escape the sinister presence that seemed to be closing in from all sides. I locked myself in the master bedroom, the whispers now a constant haunting murmur outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I couldn't stay in this house another minute. But no matter how tightly I shut my eyes, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting for me in the darkness. I spent the night huddled in the master bedroom, clutching a baseball bat I found in the closet. The whispers had faded to a faint, sporadic murmur, but I was far from reassured. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window, sent me into a panic. I felt like I was a prisoner in my own home, the darkness outside the bedroom door thick with malevolent intent. Around midnight, I heard a series of loud bangs coming from the downstairs. It was as if someone was pounding on the walls, trying to break through. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly crept out of the bedroom, the flashlight trembling in my grip. I could hear my own ragged breathing, each inhale and exhale feeling louder than the noises I was trying to escape. I moved cautiously down the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath my weight. The banging grew louder, more aggressive, as I reached the bottom. It sounded like it was coming from the living room. I shone the flashlight around. The room was empty, save for the overturned furniture and scattered debris from when I had left in a hurry. The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the photos I had found earlier. They were now scattered across the floor, their faces staring up at me with accusing eyes. I could feel the weight of their gaze, as if they were silently screaming for help. I was about to pick them up when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the hallway. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, primal and feral, filled with an anger that made my blood run cold. I froze, flashlight beam darting around the room, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move quickly along the wall. It was the same shadow I had glimpsed earlier, but this time it seemed more defined, more menacing. I turned to follow it, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My breaths were shallow, my heart racing as I tried to steady myself. I retraced my steps back to the hallway, the growling now replaced by an unsettling quiet. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. It was like someone was tapping out a message in Morse code, each tap resonating with a sense of urgency. The tapping grew louder and faster, and I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I ran back to the master bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I was exhausted, scared, and desperate to find some explanation for the horrors that were unfolding around me. In the dim light of the flashlight, I noticed something else. An old, dusty book on the nightstand I hadn't seen before. It was bound in dark leather and had strange symbols embossed on the cover. I hesitated. My curiosity got the better of me. I opened the book, and the pages were filled with the same cryptic language I had seen on the walls. As I flipped through the pages, the whispers outside the door grew louder, more insistent. The growling was back, closer now, as if whatever was tormenting me was right outside the room. I felt a surge of panic and slammed the book shut, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The whispers, fainter, seemed to echo through the darkness. I tried to and I knew I was running out of time. The house was no longer just an old building. It was a living nightmare, and I was trapped in its clutches, with no idea how to escape the terror that seemed to be closing in on me. I tried to calm my racing heart. The terror was relentless. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the whispers had escalated into an incoherent cacophony. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, each sound and shadow feeding into a growing sense of dread. Desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, I decided to leave the master bedroom. The hallway was dark, lit only by the dim beam of my flashlight. I could hear faint scratching sounds coming from behind the walls, like something was trying to claw its way out. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to pull me back. I crept down the hallway, my flashlight beam trembling with every step. The whispers were now a constant, low hum that seemed to follow me, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, hearing a loud crash from below. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity and fear drove me forward. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, and the photographs I had found were scattered everywhere. It looked like a storm had torn through the room. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house was reacting to my presence. I moved carefully through the mess, trying to piece together what had happened. The growling sound returned, but this time it was accompanied by a chilling, unnatural cold. I could see my breath misting in the air, a stark contrast to the warm night I had expected. Temperature drop was sudden, almost palpable. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The old rocking chair from the unused room was now in the living room, rocking back and forth on its own. I approached it, my flashlight revealing that the chair was damp with a dark, sticky substance. It was like something had been sitting there, something that shouldn't have been. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A loud, desperate scream coming from somewhere in the house. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fear, and it felt like it was coming from deep within the walls. I ran to the source of the scream. The house seemed to shift, leading me in circles. Finally, I reached the basement door. It was ajar, and the darkness beyond was almost suffocating. I hesitated, knowing that whatever was in the house was likely lurking there. But the scream had come from below, and I couldn't ignore it. I took a deep breath and descended the creaky stairs, the flashlight barely piercing the oppressive dark. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The whispers were now a constant, almost rhythmic chant, creating a hypnotic, unnerving atmosphere. At the far end of the basement, I saw an old wooden door that I had never noticed before. It was slightly open, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. The whispers were louder here, more urgent. I approached the door, my hand shaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, except for a single old-fashioned mirror hanging on the wall. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but as I wiped it clean, I was shocked by what I saw. My reflection was not alone. Behind me, in the mirror, was a shadowy figure standing just out of view. It had dark, hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I spun around. The room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, and the whispers had stopped abruptly. I could hear only my own ragged breathing and the thumping of my heart in my ears. The mirror seemed to hold some dark, hidden truth, and I was terrified to find out what it was. The house felt like it was closing in on me, each room more oppressive than the last. I knew I had to leave, but with the whispers growing louder and the shadows creeping closer, felt like there was no escape from the malevolent force that had taken over my home. I staggered back from the mirror, my mind racing. The figure in the reflection had been unmistakable, and the house seemed to close in around me, its oppressive darkness making every movement feel like a desperate bid for escape. The air was thick with an almost tangible malice, and I felt as though I was being suffocated by the very walls themselves. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted up the stairs, flashlight beams slicing through the dark like a beacon of hope. The whispers had started again, but this time they were joined by a low, mournful wail that seemed to seep from every corner of the house. It was as if the house itself was alive with sorrow and rage. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the bedroom door shut behind me, barricading it with the furniture I could manage. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I tried to catch my breath. I knew I had to find a way out, but the fear and exhaustion were clouding my thoughts. Suddenly, the door to the master bedroom started to rattle violently. The whispers grew louder, their words now discernible. "Come back. Come to us." It was a haunting chant, filled with desperation and anger. I could hear scratching sounds from the other side, like something or someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead, and the line was eerily silent. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely cut off from the outside world. The house was its own prison, and there was no way to escape. The rattling intensified, and I saw the door handle begin to twist. My heart raced as I realized the force trying to break through was too strong. Backed away, grabbing the baseball bat and preparing to defend myself. The whispers were now a deafening roar, and the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. In a final, desperate attempt, I smashed the window with the bat, shattering the glass. I climbed out onto the roof, feeling the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The house loomed behind me, its dark silhouette like a monstrous entity trying to reach out and pull me back inside. I shimmied down the roof and dropped to the ground, sprinting toward the street. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, the whispers fading into the distance. I didn't stop until I reached a neighbor's house and pounded on the door, screaming for help. When the police arrived, the house was empty. The officers found nothing out of place, no signs of the chaos and terror I had experienced. Photographs, the old rocking chair, and the cryptic messages were all gone. It was as if the house had swallowed everything back into its dark depth. I moved away from Salem the next day, leaving the house and the memories behind. I tried to convince myself that it was all a nightmare, figment of my imagination. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, the scratching, and the mournful wail that filled the night. The house in Salem stands as a dark reminder of that night. No one lives there now, but sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear the faintest echo of whispers carried through the night air. And I know that somewhere, in the shadows of that house, something still waits for the next unsuspecting soul to step inside. I walked through the front door of my house in Columbus, Ohio, after what felt like the longest day of my life. My wife had left for a conference in New York, and I was supposed to have the house to myself for the week. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The house was colder than usual, and there was an almost tangible stench of decay in the air. I shrugged it off as just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I figured it was the house settling, or perhaps the remnants of a forgotten meal. I went about my usual routine, trying to shake off the discomfort. But the further I got into the evening, the more the eerie feeling grew. As I was about to settle into my chair with a book, I heard it. Faint, unsettling whisper that seemed to come from somewhere upstairs. I froze, straining to hear over the creak of the old floorboards. The whispering was barely audible, like a distant murmur carried by the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the icy shiver running down my spine told me otherwise. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I knew I should have gone to bed, but curiosity and a growing sense of dread compelled me to investigate. I made my way up to the attic, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The old wooden door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with dusty old boxes and forgotten trinkets. I switched on the attic light, the bulb flickering uncertainly. The shadows danced across the walls, adding to the uneasy atmosphere. As I sifted through the clutter, I noticed an old mirror covered with a sheet. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled the sheet off. The mirror's surface was grimy and streaked with age, but as I looked into it, I saw only the empty attic behind me. Yet, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow moving. I turned around, but nothing was there. I felt a sudden chill and decided it was time to head back downstairs. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. As I descended, I glanced back up at the attic. The temperature seemed to plummet, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a heavy fog. Back in my bedroom, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind. But then, the scratching started. It was faint at first, but quickly grew louder, more frantic. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint the source. The scratching seemed to come from above, from the attic. I told myself it was just a rodent, but the fear gnawed at me. Suddenly, the house was too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I could swear I heard faint voices, whispers that grew louder as if they were calling my name. Panic set in as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from last night. I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a side effect of exhaustion. I went about my day. The house's cold, oppressive atmosphere clung to me like a shadow. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house grew darker, I found myself inexplicably drawn back to the attic. I had to know what was causing the noises, even if it meant confronting my fears. The moment I opened the attic door, I was hit with a musty odor, a mix of old wood and something more rancid. I flicked on the light, and it illuminated a space that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny ghosts, and the old boxes seemed to watch me with their faded, eye-like labels. I made my way to the center of the room, where the old mirror still stood, shrouded under the dusty sheet. My hands trembled as I pulled the sheet off once more. This time, the mirror's surface was clearer, but it still reflected only the empty room. I was about to turn away when a flicker of movement caught my eye. There was something off in the reflection, a dark shadow that seemed to shift behind me. I whipped around, but the attic was empty. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and I felt an icy finger trace down my spine. It was as if the very air had turned malevolent. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just the play of shadows. But then I noticed an old photograph, half buried in a stack of boxing. I picked it up, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a faded black and white photo of a family I didn't recognize. They looked happy, but their eyes seemed to follow me, full of an unsettling intensity. I quickly put the photo down and decided it was time to leave. But as I turned to go, a sudden crash from behind made me jump. I spun around, heart pounding, found nothing amiss. Just the old boxes, now seemingly more sinister in the dim light. The noise continued, growing louder and more frantic. It sounded like scratching, but now it was accompanied by low, guttural groans. I couldn't stand it any longer. I rushed downstairs, trying to ignore the whispers that had begun again, louder and more insistent. It was as if they were closing in on me, their voices blending into a single, eerie chorus. Once downstairs, I locked the attic door and sat in the living room, trying to steady my breathing. The house was silent again, but the sense of dread remained. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified, as if something was lurking just out of sight. My mind raced with question. What was in the attic? Why did that photograph feel so wrong? I knew I had to find answers. The thought of going back up there was almost unbearable. The whispers in the shadows had left me shaken. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined everything. I locked all the doors and windows, turned on every light in the house, and even set up a few motion-activated cameras. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I did everything right, I'd be safe. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house, once a comforting refuge, now felt like a trap. The temperature had dropped again, and despite the heat running, I could see my breath forming tiny clouds in the air. Around midnight, as I lay in bed, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to echo in my mind, the scratching started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the attic, not just random noises, but deliberate, angry sounds. The whispers began again, louder and more distinct. I could hear my name being called. Over and over, "David, David." The voices were soft at first, but they grew in intensity, filling the room with an oppressive sense of dread. The scratching grew louder, as if something or someone was trying to break through. I grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs, every step feeling like a mile. My hands shook as I reached the attic door, the old wood creaking ominously under my touch. The door, which I had locked earlier, was now slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I pushed the door open slowly, and the light from my flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade. The attic looked the same as before, but the air was thick with an almost tangible malice. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners, moving in ways that didn't quite make sense. Then, I saw it. The old mirror was no longer covered with a sheet. It stood there, uncovered, and in its reflection, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes like black voids. It was standing behind me in the mirror, but when I spun around, it was gone. Panic surged through me. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had become screams now, cacophony of tormented voices. The scratching intensified, turning into a relentless pounding, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the walls. I stumbled back downstairs, but the house seemed to conspire against me. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, chilling voice that screamed my name. In the living room, I tried to call for help, but the phone line was dead. I felt trapped like a rat in a cage. The cold was unbearable, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a prelude to something terrible. The clock struck 3 a.m., and the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet pressed down on me. I knew something was coming, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. I could feel its presence, like a predator stalking its prey, and I knew that whatever it was far from finished. The silence was unbearable. I sat frozen in the living room, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The oppressive stillness felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the eerie quiet. I tried to steady my breathing, but every little sound, every distant creak or rustle, sent my nerves into overdrive. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they would return, and when they did, I wouldn't be able to escape them. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, the temperature returned to normal, and the house was eerily calm. I felt like I was in a waking nightmare, where the horror could return at any moment. I decided I had to leave, but the thought of staying another night was unbearable. I packed a few things hastily, not caring about what I left behind. My wife's flight landed early, and she arrived home just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. When she saw me, she immediately noticed my pale face and disheveled appearance. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. It told her everything, from the whispers and the scratching to the terrifying shadows in the attic. She listened, her face growing more concerned with every word. I could see the disbelief in her eyes. The fear was there too. We decided to check the attic together. As we climbed the stairs, I could barely contain my anxiety. I unlocked the attic door, and as we stepped inside, I half expected the horror to start all over again. But everything was quiet. The mirror was still there, uncovered, but no shadows or whispers were visible. The old photograph was gone. The mirror's surface reflected nothing but the empty attic. I could hardly believe my eyes. Had it all been a trick of my mind? We decided to leave the house. I didn't want to stay another minute, and neither did she. We packed up what we could and left. The house was soon on the market, and the new owners were a young couple, excited for their new home. I hope they never experience what I did. I've since learned that the house had a history. Previous owners had reported strange occurrences, but nothing as extreme as what I went through. I've tried to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, waiting in the dark corners of that house, whispering, watching, and waiting for its next victim. To this day, I can't walk past an old mirror without a shiver running down my spine. I don't know if the house was haunted, or if it was just a figment of my imagination, but whatever it was, it left me with a deep-seated fear that I can't seem to escape. And every night, when I lie in bed, I wonder if the whispers will come back and if the shadows will reach out for me again. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight, decamp.